Ahojte moji milí tretiaci, vítam vás na ďalšej hodine a na tretej zo 4 tém, ktoré máme z novoveku, z raného novoveku. A ako vidíte, Age of Discoveries, no a prezentáciu, ktorú pre vás som dnes pripravil, tak vychádza z poznámok, ktoré máte vo Worde a ktoré si môžete aj stiahnuť, alebo ste si už stiahli. No, prezentáciu som chcel už dlhšie, aby som nemal toľko textu a skúsil to odučiť rýchlejšie, pretože v tejto téme sa ja vždy zakecám, tam sa proste nedá nezakecať. No a uvidím, ak sa mi to podarí dnes. No, nezabudnite samozrejme na Facebooku komentovať pod statusom a pod linkom na toto video otázku. Ďakujem, že ste sa minulý týždeň vyjadrili, teda, že vám vyhovuje tento spôsob hodín. V podstate aj mňa, keď musím tie hodiny nahrávať dopredu, ale aj teraz je v podstate pre mňa ešte piatok, február, 26. februára. No, nezabudnite teda odpovedať, no a samozrejme dúfam, že vám to teda pomôže pri vypracovaní. Samozrejme tu máte viacej vecí, najmä tá slepá mapa je taká fajná vec, chutná vec, takže dajte si na to záležať, pretože ak budem vidieť nejaké okopčené veci alebo tak samozrejme budem odratovať percentá a body. Dobre, poďme teda na to. So, Age of Discoveries. This topic sometimes called also the period of explorations or age of explorations, because explore and discover is something different. So I would say the discovery was it for Europe, for Europeans, of course not for Native Americans or Asians in China, India, for example, or African countries, of course. But exploration went further on, because to explore is not only seas but also lands, of course. Study materials, as always, are basic basic books, are history books that we have in Slovak or in English. But unfortunately for you, in the classroom we have. But also I use this book that I strongly recommend to you. Actually, there are two volumes of it. Objavovanie Ameriky, Nicholas Horden, and this is the second part. And it's a really famous book from late 1980s, and first volume about early discoveries that I'm going to tell you. So if you are into this topic, definitely do not hesitate, go to the library, and definitely they will have this book. It looks like for the kids, but the volume, the amount of information is incredible. And of course, because it's topic for the world history and big ones, so there is great amount of sources all around the internet that also I used. Okay, so let's start from the beginning, because exploration of new lands, it's all history of mankind, of humankind, but this specific is expansion of European countries. And this part I will mention also Chinese, for example. And since the 15th century, European explorers and especially navigators sailed to previously unknown lands. Of course, I mean for them, so it is a bit different. So let's introduce you first how to call them early seafarers and early discoverers. Among the countries we mentioned, actually all of them, so sometimes I gave you some word about, for example, Phoenicians, that they were really successful tradesmen, merchants who sailed in the Mediterranean Sea, and they built and established many colonies, just like Carthage or Carthage, as it is called. But they also successfully sailed to the Atlantic Ocean, and we know we have evidence that they discovered Canaries, for example, probably Azores, of course, along the coast of Africa. And there is nice information. Unfortunately, we cannot prove it. So far, it is just like myth, more or less, that on the beaches of Brazil, in 19th century, I believe they found a stela, that is stone, like stone with writing, and it was in Phoenician alphabet. So unfortunately, it was said that it was lost. So we have no evidence that Phoenicians were the guys who discovered America, but before Columbus or Vikings and so on. Greeks were another guys, and I think that you may have heard that I told you during the colonization, great Greek colonization in archaic period between 7th and 5th century and up to 3rd century BC, when Greeks greatly mapped also Mediterranean Sea, but also many lands around. So they sailed even over or beyond the pillars of Heracles, that is Gibraltar. Of course, they called it like this and supposed it to be the end of the world, which was not. And we know that Greeks sailed again to Canaries, is a really popular destination. And one expedition actually sailed somewhere down to the south along the African coast, and suddenly after many years they appeared somewhere near Egypt. So their possible explanation is again that they sailed around the Africa and before the Portuguese. Again, we this is just like something that we cannot prove, and we cannot say that it happened. Romans, on the other hand, are really forgotten navigators, and they did a really job that Portuguese were only dreaming, because they conquered Egypt. So they had ports also in the Red Sea, and from the Red Sea they started trade with Arabs in Arabic Peninsula, and from there it is pretty easy to sail along the coast to Iran, to Persia, and from there to India. And actually Romans had actually open trade with some of the Indian principalities, and that was like really dense international trade with China too along the Silk Road. So this is really interesting, and Romans, among the many things they did, it was forgotten. Another nation that was great navigators and travelers and always forgotten are Arabs. Actually, their geographical position thing, that's why I showed you this map, actually gave them perfect access not even to Europe or Mediterranean across the Middle East, but also to the Arabian Sea, and Indian Ocean, and so on. Since the times when they start to expand their great expansion during the times of Umayyad and Abbasid Arabic Caliphate and spreading Islam. So, of course, as merchants, they sailed, and not only they traded with all the products and goods they had, but they also start to spread Islam on these voyages. And in this way, as you can see, the sea routes in blue, in red, it's a connection to the Silk Road, which is this main highway from Beijing and Zhushu and so on. So they actually sailed not only to India but even beyond, and they were spreading this Islam. And what is interesting, when they finally came to the lands where cultural maybe basement or roots were not so strong, the bounds were not so strong to their original religion, like it was Hinduism in India or Buddhism in Southeast Asia, but they came to Indonesia, so they start spreading Islam, and they managed that merchants and missionaries spreaded Islam so much that Indonesia today is actually the biggest, I mean the most populated Muslim country in the world, so despite not being Arabic at all. So imagine that during all these periods until Ottoman Empire destroyed Arabic Caliphate eventually. So Arabs had like everyday common trade with Indonesia, with so-called the islands of spices, with China, of course, India, and with Europe, with the Byzantine Empire. So this is really interesting, and again, being like forgotten, being forgotten by Europeans very often. Yeah, you know, this ship, the Drakkars, and of course Norsemen, Vikings, were these lucky guys and European navigators using a very primitive but actually very clever idea of using quartz mineral that you remember from our early medieval history. And you know that Vikings successfully sailed in North Atlantic Ocean from their homeland in Scandinavia, and not only attacking, of course, coasts of Europe, Western Europe, and coming even to Byzantine Empire across Russia, but Norwegian Vikings, Norwegian Norsemen, they sailed even to Iceland, Far East, and you remember great stories of Leif Erikson, that how he sailed even to Greenland, how he discovered there, established, like founded first settlements in there. At the time, it was possible because in early Middle Ages, sorry, The climate was a bit warmer. I would compare it to these days. And if you give a chance, couple of centuries to this global warming, probably Greenland will be much more pleasant place to live than it was in this early modern period, what we call like a little ice age, like period of climate colding. Vikings and Leif Erikson finally managed to sail and discover actually islands in Canada, what is nowadays, and sailing down to Vinland, which is nowadays Newfoundland, which is actually like almost southeastern part of Canada. Vikings didn't. They failed in establishing their colony in Vinland, in this Newfoundland. Probably they were killed by Native Americans. They were called Skrellings in their sagas, and even in Greenland they had to abandon it in this like 12th 13th century because the climate was getting colder, and really they didn't have enough important materials they needed, like timber, wood, which was not present in Iceland either. Also, Iceland was decimated by a couple of epidemics, so for many years these travels were being forgotten, and they remained only in sagas in Norway, in Iceland, being told by grannies to their children about mythical Skrellings and sea maids and great voyages, adventures of Leif Erikson. You know that it is connection probably with Columbus, and this is nice story. But in Europe, of course, Middle Ages were not Vikings were not the last seafarers. Of course, there were crusades. If you remember that, for example, the Republic of Venice provided ships for many crusade campaigns to Middle East, and in this way, many Europeans discovered Middle East. I don't mean only Islam and hygiene and fruits and windmills and so on, but also they discovered geography. Arabs had excellent geography, that as you already know, and they didn't mind using actually pagan European sources from antiquity, Greece, ancient Greek sources, maps like Ptolemy's maps from Hellenistic Egypt, and so on. So in this way, they were coming back with a lot of knowledge that was kind of forgotten or not being promoted in Europe of those times. And you know that Catholic Church, very often, usually was against these progressive things, especially they claimed something. Of course, they had to change it, and humanism Renaissance, if you remember, brought also changing thinking also in the Holy See, where popes started to accept new opinions about like the earth is a globe and so on. Venetian merchants, even from not only from Venice but also from the Republic of Genoa, further continued, especially during the Mongol expansion. They used a situation, if you remember, Pax Romana, the peace of Romans. There was a situation when Romans for a couple of centuries overruled almost all southern Europe, and thanks to their rule, despite of course it was oppressive, but after defeating their enemies and oppressing Celtic and Romanizing local population, they built roads and towns and cities, and their stable rule actually made his country safe. I mean, from brigands, from attacks and robberies and so on. So for you, it was safe to travel from London, from Londinium, maybe even from Hibernia, from Ireland, and travel to Romania, to Dacia, or to Mesopotamia, to Egypt, you know. So they call it Pax Romana, which means occupation of some foreign forces, but it forced everybody to behave properly, you know. Some guy comes and oppress you all, but you have to be quiet and calm, you know. This is actually sign a feature of totalitarian regimes, that there is no crime. And this happened with Mongol invasion, when Mongols had suddenly in this 13th century of times of Marco Polo, empire huge across all Asia. And it was, if you were actually good, if you get on well with Mongols, so they gave you permit to travel. That was a seal or kind of a stick with signatures of sometimes Khan it himself, and it gave you like safe passage across their lands. And that happened that uncles of Marco Polo traveled from Venice to former Kievan Rus being destroyed by Mongolians, and they traveled across the Silk Road to Beijing, that was at the time new capital of Mongolian Khanates of Kublai Khan, Khan Kublai. And their second route was actually accompanied with their nephew, with Marco Polo, and he spent there 20 years in China. Even Kublai Khan appointed him as the governor, one of the Chinese provinces. After 20 years of service and after the Kublai Khan, and I should have shown you not the modern version of this TV series, but I decided to show you one when I was 1 year old from 1982, and it's Italian. But as you see, when Japan, China held an 81%, it's really cool rating, and there are no videos in here, but at least couple of pictures, and it's really great and. Sophisticated, highly sophisticated, and historically mostly accurate TV series with I don't know how many, 600 minutes together. So maybe 10 episodes, or I don't know, maybe 6 episodes, like big ones, like movies each. And this is really interesting because he, after 20 years of service, he asked Kublai Khan to come back home, and which allowed him and gave him ships. So he came back using Chinese ships and Indian ships. Okay, sorry, I just come back here from his roots. Maybe I should add these pictures. Yeah, so how he traveled with his uncle, spending these years in these provinces in here in the south, and then taking ships you see through Singapore, India, coming back home again to Persia and traveling back home. Here, almost at home, he was captured by Genoese because he was Venetian, so they imprisoned him. And when they asked him who is he and where was he, where did he travel from, so he started telling his story, and actually they made inquisition process with him because they didn't believe him. So he finally persuaded him somehow that he really spent like 20 years in Asia, and when he got back home finally to Venice, so he wrote a book about it. It was cool. It got a beautiful name called Million, and like million of wonders of the world that he saw. And for centuries, people really didn't believe him, and it was great inspiration. Like first of one of the first travel books. And it motivated many people to go there. And actually, sometimes he exaggerated the riches, which even more motivated many people, merchants and discoverers, to go to Kitai or Katai as they called China of the dynasty Ming of those times. And that was really wealthy for them and attractive. So in this way, of course, Italian city-states sailed especially Mediterranean Sea, but they sailed all around, and sometimes they had like a lot of trade with also another alliance of free towns in the Baltic Sea and in the Northern Sea, and you remember it from the League of Hansa or Hanseatic League or Hanseatic towns. There were many German towns, Polish towns, Latvian towns, Estonian towns, of course, from Norway, Sweden. There were even towns in England in here, and they traded without paying toll. So this was really open, like small European Union in the naval form in Middle Ages, in Gothic period. And many of these Italians sailed to these Hanseatic towns to make trade, and among them, on the ships of from Venice and from Genoa, there was one guy sitting that was Christoph Columbus, and he got a lot of experience, like sailing around Europe and also knowing stories of Marco Polo, and also spending time in Iceland, twice sailing to Iceland. So there is nice hypothesis that he probably heard these sagas and fairy tales about great Viking exploration and Skrellings and elves and the end of the world of Vinland on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, which probably made him believe. But one country that is again forgotten very often and probably could have been the one that discovered the world, and even Europe, and not Europe will discover the world, and that was China. China in the during the dynasty called Ming, that finally defeated Mongols and banished them from Beijing, and also continued building the Great Wall. So they at the beginning started to be very open-minded, and they realized, come on, like there are many things in the outside in the world. What about building some like fleet of great merchant ships accompanied by battleships, and try to like make trade and friendship and diplomacy with many countries around. So in this way, Chinese imagine that at the time when we were like amazed with 1 million population of Constantinople or Rome, and Chinese had like 20 towns, 20 cities like this with over million population. So they were able to build a huge fleet of about like 300, maybe even more. I can't remember the number of ships that were even like as big as European navigator ship, but actually more than 20 or 30 of huge ships that were for storage load with products and goods they wanted to trade. So this is comparison, guys, of Santa Maria, flagship of Christoph Columbus that discovered America in 1492, and this is comparison of the ships from almost like uh, 1 century, not 1 century, but like 90 or 80 years ago, before that sailed with huge, like they had like fleet of 3 ships, and Chinese had got like 200 or 300 ships. Their admiral was Sheng He, probably from Uyghur, if I can remember properly, Uyghur minority in West China, and he organized this fleet and sailed down to South Asia, to Siam, which is Thailand nowadays, of course to Malaysia, as you see that, even to Bangladesh, to Calicut, to India, and doing trade all around Mughal Empire, that is one of the last Mongolian Empire in North India, but even here in Hormuz and Hormuz, which is Persia, so Iran nowadays, and even to Jeddah and Mogadishu, so Somalia, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia. From here, it is so close to Egypt. It's here, guys. And we talk about 1405, 1433. So imagine in the times when we had Hussite wars in here, Sigismund of Luxembourg. So at the time, Chinese fleet was discovering world, and they ended up in here, like one step next to the Ottoman Empire. So that was really interesting. And if you remember the inventions that Chinese had, among them there was also printing press. And actually, invention or construction of printing press in Europe by Johann Gutenberg came like maybe 20 years after this event. So I had like nice dream hypothesis, of course, that maybe Johann Gutenberg heard some news, and maybe he met with some guy who either met with one of the members of the crew of this Shenke Chinese fleet, or maybe he met with them and somehow learned this technology. So he just like took it over. He was not the inventor, but Chinese were, because they had been using it. But what happened on their expeditions? Chinese realized that none of the countries, even amazing in Indonesia or India or Arabic empire that was destroyed by Ottoman attacks at that time, none of these lands, none of these countries possess the riches that Chinese had already had before. So they came back and they reported to the emperor that, well, maybe diamonds, but that's all, and ivory. But we can just trade it. They can come. We don't need to build ships and go there, because they gladly come here, because we produce porcelain and silk. We got gold, silver. We got inventions. We are highly more civilized than the others. So now, what did these emperors of Ming dynasty did? They decided to destroy, abandon this idea of fleet and naval trade, and they rather invested their money in finishing the Great Wall, and actually meeting with the fact that many of the empires are really aggressive. They rather isolated themselves, and China during the dynasty of Ming actually made this isolation that was not very helpful for them, because for that reason they missed what Europe had: humanism and Renaissance in one point, later on scientific revolution caused by this, later enlightenment, and thanks to enlightenment, industrial revolution. So suddenly, when Europeans came here and it came to China, there was not such a big difference. But for the Europeans using Ottoman type of these fire guns, they had gunpowder, but not for weapons. But when finally Europeans came again in the 19th century and to India in the 18th century, they brought cannons and railways and steamships and with machine guns. and suddenly they actually subjected, oppressed these great civilizations, and Chinese had no chance to defend it. And it took them like all these 19th and 20th century to break it through. And despite of communism that China built up, actually only these last decades, China finally managed to get a place they had before for all the centuries. Because even in the times of Roman Empire, maybe only Romans came like well known for Chinese that all these guys are cool. Like it's worthy to open Silk Road with them and trade. But once the Roman Empire fell down, I forgot to tell you one important thing, that not only Venetian merchants but even Pope was sending their emissaries, ambassadors to negotiate with Mongolian Khan to fight against the Muslims in Middle East. And suddenly you see that it was not worthy for them to keep Silk Road open or safe or something like that. No, contrary, they built the Chinese wall and isolated themselves. So that's another reason why China had this like break in the history of their development. So this is interesting story of Shanghai, and you see that it's difficult not to speak a lot about that. But what is the point? This topic, because suddenly only now we will closely come closer to the topic itself. Still not the end, is that two countries for us, for our Eurocentristic point of view, were the discovering, were these explorating nations, and that was Spain and Portugal. There were two naval powers that popped up in the 15th century, and they sailed to the Atlantic Ocean and in two directions, one to east and one to west. East around Africa, because there was no other route there, done by Portuguese, and by Spain the others. So here in the picture, also pictures from from medieval Hispania, or Spain and Hispanic kingdoms, as we call about them. We'll find up in Portuguese caravella, or caravella, that is ship of this typical Gothic period, sometimes in the north called Koga. But again, we need to speak of what was happening in Iberian Peninsula by this time until the 15th century. So very quickly, if you remember, what I suddenly talk about was that ethnicity of the people of Spaniards, of Hispanic people, is really interesting, because if you were looking for the oldest nation in Europe genetically and even their language, definitely that would be Basques. Basques living in this northeastern parts of Spain, speaking like ancient language. But many other nations were coming here, many various Celtic tribes, generally called Ibers or Iberians. But Romans, who came there later in the times of Punic Wars and First Triumvirate, and they made it province Hispania. So they call it Iberia generally. But there were many others. One part settled by Gauls was called Galicia. The other was called Lusitania, and this is today it's Portugal. So this province Hispania and was very important for Romans, and it was Romanized. So this is the way how this original population, apart from Basques, and was actually Romanized. Even when Germanic tribes invaded these lands, especially Visigoths and Vandals for a short time, so all these nations were just like swallowed by these Romans majority. You know that Arabic Caliphate expanded even here, and when they cross these straits, the Pillars of Heracles, so they give it a new name according to the commander of these Arabic armies, Tariq, and they start to call this cliff above this strait the Jebel el Tariq, which means the rock or the mountain of Tariq, and we know it as Gibraltar. And they start the conquest of this Hispania, and they call it different names. They call it the Caliphate of Cordoba or Caliphate of Toledo, and they actually, thanks to kind of like nice besieged by seas, climate common for Arabs, and a unsuccessful invasion to Francia, they established their own rule in here, and they spread especially in southern parts. What is the thing? Soon we'll start from year 1000. As you see, Arabic, Mozarabic lands in here. But what happened that in these lands, in this Caliphate of Cordoba, as proper Muslims respecting Jews and Christians, So they didn't mind translating Greek texts, especially when it gave them great knowledge from medicine, from astronomy, and from geography. And in this way, that was second source apart from Venice and Crusades. So this was another way of how this Greek antique scholarship and knowledge came back to Europe. Again, thanks to Muslim scholars. And that was another inspiration for Christians for this moment. And because you can deny it, I don't know, somewhere in Germany, here in Kingdom of Hungary, but not in Spain, when you have libraries full of maps and full of globes, and so these people, as also their orientation in the seas, so many of the ship masters just sail to the open or get lost in the seas. So they knew more about it, and they believe that probably like the idea is like Earth is globe, or there are some lands in the west, so it was much more common. Still, Arabs didn't survive, as you can see in this map, for a while, because this is actually linguistic map, so there were languages, as you can see, there is Portuguese, Galician, Leonese, Castilian, Aragonese, Catalan, Basque in here, Occitanese, Southern French, and this actually shows depiction of one moment that we call Reconquista, the reconquest of these Arabic lands, or Arabic Caliphate of Cordoba, or Mar, as they were called Mars, by at the beginning small Christian kingdoms in the north. Look at this. See, Galicia. Maybe I should stop it. Okay, it doesn't work. But as you see, Galicia, Leon, Castilla, and Aragon. Of course, some of them, like Navarra, was Basque land, Catalan, or sometimes like Kingdom of Naples. But the languages in here, from small kingdoms like this, start with reconquest, and it lasted for almost 5 or 6 centuries together. So when I move on to the Reconquista, as I said, since 11th century in the north, surviving small Christian kingdoms, as I mentioned, Aragon, not Aragon, of course, Navarra, Castile, Leon, and even Portugal from Galicia, started to organize their campaigns. When in 1095 Pope Urban II proclaimed First Crusade, so some of these Aragonese and Castilian, Leonese knights and noblemen asked for the audience for the meeting with the Pope, and they said like, "We are sorry, but you proclaimed this crusade to Holy Land, to Jerusalem, but we have been already fighting this kind of crusade, and it's against pagans, still the same Muslims in here in our lands. So what about let's join?" And immediately Urban II said, "Come on, you are leading your own crusade, so your crusade is the same important as this one. So anybody who even helps to you, so he will be given salvation, just like all the crusades leading to Holy Land." You know that it was propaganda of them, but the point was that now these Hispanic Iberian kingdoms and knights could organize it and call this crusade with a new word, Reconquista. It means reconquering of the lands they had lost from the times of Visigothic kingdom or Roman Empire. Okay, this Reconquista followed, and by the 15th century, they managed to occupy, from their point of view, deliberate large lands. Contrary, during these times, that Christians were not so tolerant as Muslims and of those times, and they started with expulsion of Moors, of Arabs, and even Jews, because Jews had to adjust to any system, any nation, any occupational rule. So in this way, they establish this infamous trials of the Inquisition, and in which many Jews, especially called Ashkenazi Jews, just abandoned these Spanish kingdoms, and they found shelter in, at that time, the most tolerant kingdoms of Europe, and that was Poland, Lithuania, and Kingdom of Hungary. And that's why the highest number of Jews in Europe by the times of Holocaust, by the 20th century, Second World War, were in Poland, in Ukraine, and also in Eastern Slovakia. Okay, but let's move back. Finally, there were two or three main dominant kingdoms. Of course, there was still the small but very important kingdom of Navarra. I will mention it during times of Reformation. Kingdom of Majorca even, but there were two: Kingdom of Aragon with this Catalonian-speaking population, and the Kingdom of Castile and Leon that was being united. Kingdom of Portugal was like for themselves, sometimes even start to fight against Castilia, against Castile, and one moment came like before 1492, like in 1490s, that the king Ferdinand of Aragon was looking for a bride, and what a coincidence! At the time, the kingdom of Castile had a queen, Isabella, and so he asked her to marry him, and she said, "Okay, I shall marry you, and we can unite our two great kingdoms. But as a wedding gift, you have to give me the last stand of Moors, last stand of Muslims in Iberian Peninsula. That was Kingdom of Granada or Emirate of Granada. Where is my here is my cursor. And it was actually like beautiful town high in the mountains, because in these lands there is actually the highest continental mountain of Spain, Mulhacen. Yeah, I think it's called Mulhacen, more than 3,800 meters above sea level, I believe, and it was besieged, and protected from all these Reconquista campaigns. So he promised to do that. So combined Castilian Aragonese king the armies invaded Granada, and after the siege, they finally conquered it. And immediately after this, after the conquest, there was a big wedding in which Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon had a wedding, and they created a new kingdom they came from unification of these two or last two kingdoms, including Leon and Galicia and many others. And for a while, even Portugal was part of this, called derived from name Hispania, and in their language called España, and we called it as Kingdom of Spain. And it will be actually the most powerful kingdom by maybe like the end of by 30 years worth of beginning of half of 17th century, when France will replace them, and even Habsburg monarchy. So this is really interesting. So the result of Reconquista was that actually these two countries came to exist, and they had enough time and peace to organize and waste money on this thing like sailing abroad. So you cannot like go and sail around with canoe drill in your own island. Remember England, when until the time they didn't defeat Scotland and occupy Scotland, so they were unsuccessful in France. But later on, they won almost all the wars they had. Um Okay, so they became strong enough, just like Portugal and so on. And this is very famous painting that is depiction of how the last emir of Granada is handing over the keys from the gates of Granada, surrendering to the Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, with a herald with the lions of Leon and so on. And usually, I always tell somewhere in here among the faces, I should have added the face of Cristoforo Colombo, as it was known at those times, Genoese navigator that had already offered a plan, proposal about Spanish or Castilian fleet sailing across the Atlantic Sea due to the west, to the end of the world, and they would not fall down to the hell, but they would discover not new land, but they would discover Kitai, or China, Japan, and the lands that of the desire for the luxury goods. So you see that we also needed to explain Reconquista and unification of these lands. Still, we did many things, because it's not so easy to just get on the ship when you have no idea how far it is and what is there. So you needed all the things: spirit of renaissance and humanism. So new discoveries that the earth is a globe, for example. It's not discovery. Greeks had known it before. Democritus, whoever, I don't know which of the Greek philosophers, he was watching just ships sailing, and he saw that they are not like getting smaller, but only the tip of the ship is going like behind the sea. So he understands. So then it must be, it's not flat, it's like this one, what many people, including this other famous singer in Slovakia, don't know. But if you are there in the sea, you see it, that it's actually going down. So this is among the things that we are capable of going there. And from the maps that we have in here about discoveries, innovation, technologies, cartography, that we can move from this type of map that is well known from since the Roman times. Romans and Greeks knew these lands: Arabic Peninsula, India, somewhere Indonesia, Kitai, so China and Africa, and nobody knew where is this Terra Australis, in Latin, land of the south. Australis, it means south. So you needed to move to something what is here, and this is map from maybe mid 18th century, that we already know that it is globe, and we are mapping all the coasts. Okay, probably up the years of the Francis Drake discoveries and early Dutch discoveries. The other thing was that even navigation needed some technological advances, and that was, for example, new type of what is called lateen sails. Po slovensky to nazývame latínske, nie latinské, ale latínske plachty. What is interesting that these latin sails, give me a moment guys, sorry, are a triangle shape, so very different from Vikings use, and I can tell you that this is Arabic style. This is how even today Arabic yachts and ships they have, like fishermen, I don't know, from Oman or Yemen, they sail to the sea when this type of these sails, plachty. So, but at the time they call it Latin sails. Uh, and the Portuguese started to use it, and they also had to build bigger ships that could carry enough load, enough man, enough water, enough food for these long distance voyages. So this is how Caravelle was constructed, that the ship that you've seen just a moment ago, and ended up in let's say end of 16th century, like 1 century later, with galleons. Galleonas were huge ships with many sails that could carry even about like 1,000 sailors and shipmasters and soldiers included, and filled out with the treasures from the New World. They were being sunk by pirates from England, for example. And even today, like scuba divers are going down discovering these galleons, but they were really huge, even concerning our size and our ratios. The other thing they need to invent were, for example, invention of astrolabe, sextant, or usage of compass that again Chinese had known before, but in Europe it was unknown, so they had to know it and constructed it like this. So this is the earliest form of caravel, of Portuguese ship, with only two Latin sails, big enough, and this it looks very small, doesn't it? Sailed to down to Africa, to the Bay of Good Hope. Astrolabe, as you can see in here, sextant is, you can hear, compass from these times is in magnetic poles, and this is the thing one that desire why you need to go to uh, open seas, to such great terrible dangers. So what other things you need to have? You need to have firearms, because just like Vikings, they had axes and swords. It's not advantage against tomahawk and bows and arrows of Skrellings or Native Americans. When even Portuguese sailed to India for the first time, so Indians, Rajas asked them, and okay, so what have you offered? We have fire guns. So what? Even we have fire guns. But in China, for example, they were not using them, so they need to have some advantage, especially in Africa and in Americas. It was a tremendous advantage against indigenous population. Using cannons and guns only scared them and gave great advantage against locals. The other thing was desire for expensive luxury goods, spices, silk, porcelain, ivory from Africa, slaves from Africa. All these things, search for wealth, made the Europeans that they would like to go to Africa, to Asia, and so on. And what interrupted this trade across the Silk Road was the Ottoman Empire, because they took it all, and if they sold something to Europeans, it was with tremendous toll, and for them it was actually more efficient to invest in great discoveries in here. Okay, so the other thing is the navigators even hope to make some great discoveries to seize honor and glory, and this is a common thing in here. And what I mentioned was the rise of Ottoman Empire, and because Constantinople was always the like final destination at the Silk Road, and from here Venice and Genoa spread it even to Western Europe. Once it was interrupted, and from Istanbul, Ottomans release only some small amount of goods, not enough for Western Europe. So Italians start to search for new land, and of course, the unification of Spain and power of Portugal of those times allowed them to do that, and became famous and glorious for the others. So Ottoman occupation of trade routes from Asia, and it brought a need to find a new route to Asia. The other thing that is always omitted is that many people still had it as a main thing that just spreading Christianity. Because when you have Christian land, it's much higher possibility that these guys will be your allies, maybe against other Christians, but then the enemy is definitely better than Muslims, for example. Okay, so in this way, that was the reason why they even the Pope asked Mongolian Khan to help against Arabic Caliphate. It's like asking the devil to defeat some your neighbor, From the point of Europe, what, for example, Eastern Europe survived under Mongolian attacks. So that was interesting thing, and missionaries were important guys spreading here. And rise of the power of the Portugal and Spain again. Before we start out with them, I need to check out my time. Okay, so I got 15 minutes, so I believe we can find at least this point, and we will see how much time we've got left. So, this Age of Discoveries or Age of Exploration is actually Portuguese and Spanish explorations, or only their voyages in the 15th, 16th century. Because I'm not going to tell you about how they discovered Amazonia or how they settled down in Colombia and so on. So the beginning is actually at this guy. We have got a portrait, and it is the King of Portugal. It was King of Portugal, of course, called Henry. Henry, I have to check out actually the Portuguese pronunciation. And his nickname is Navigator. And it's really interesting, funny, because he sailed like maybe twice or three times in his lifetime. And especially when he was organizing these voyages, he was just sitting in this throne room in Lisboa, and the capital of Portugal, and he just organized it, supported it. Despite they started calling Henry the Navigator, po slovensky Henrich Moreplavec. And this is an interesting story because when he was a young boy, uh, with his brothers, they were more brothers. So, as young princes of Portugal, they were growing up listening to great stories about Reconquista, heroic knights fighting, deliberating, fighting the Moors, deliberating occupied Christian towns of Iberian Peninsula, and unifying Portugal. From since the times of El Cid, a legendary knight of the Spanish kingdoms of Aragon, Castile. So they believe that one of the greatest things and goals, aims of any ruler and any knight, medieval knight of early 15th century, should be like glory and fame. And actually, this is the first guy who got motivation was had this maybe for you least probable style like I want to be hero, I want to be knight. And the problem was that for Portugal at the time, Reconquista had already ended up because the Granada was the only surviving, and it was besieged by Castilian territory. So for them, they had no enemies around. So as they were growing up, so they were really like lust and warmongering, but nobody to fight. And when they heard the merchants that across the sea, across the Gibraltar, down in south in Algiers and Morocco, down there are cities, Muslim cities. They are really like full of riches and possible loot and possible heroic deeds for them. So in this way, they persuaded their father to allow them to build a couple of ships. Of course, medieval ships of this type of koga, and got on the board and some other knights like adventurers, and they sailed to Tangier. I'm not sure which of the cities of Morocco, Algeria was it, and they actually sailed there. And these Moors, they didn't have their cities were not even fortified because they didn't expect anybody to attack them for millennia. Since times of barbaric tribes, there was no need. If there were any fortification, it was against maybe some like very old ones. So it was a big surprise when suddenly Christians, Portuguese with big white red crosses, sign of Portugal of those times, embanked. They attacked the city, stormed the city, and killed a lot of people, and they looted it. But what a surprise when they came back. Of course, they were like heroes. Now we fulfill this mission of chivalry code, this by killing of people. But they discovered that these Arabic towns having this trade across all Africa, it was full of gold, of ivory, and black slaves because Arabs had already traded with black slaves, and this became such a great motivation for the business that they decided to organize more and more attacks on these more cities in North Africa and at least to conquer them. Uh, when in the times when Henry the Navigator became the king, so he couldn't go on the open seas, so it was impossible for them to organize attacks because the Sultan of Morocco already organized, built up fortifications, and they get like informed about the moves of these Portuguese ships. So it was very difficult for them to attack these towns again. So instead of these military naval campaigns to Africa, they turned to trade. And if you want to trade, you need to have map where you go, and they realized they didn't know Africa at all. So he started to organize and support actually these geographical discoveries and trade campaigns and voyages to Africa in order to systematically map the coast. So every mission, every voyage had to be asked by the king. He asked the committee of navigators. For them he established even school because they're getting old, so he didn't new ones. And even somebody, yeah, I want to sail the open sea. If I wanted to do that, I don't know how to handle it, how to control, and so on. So they needed to know about shipbuilding, to fight. They needed to know astronomy, get orientation, how to work with astrolabe, with compass, how to draw map, and all this stuff. So for that reason, established even the School of Navigation in Lisbon, and this is actually the interior with late Gothic style. So in this way, anybody who wanted to attend it, he had to study at this School of Navigation, and he was given some support from the king, Henry the Navigator, but he had to come back with loot or with traded materials, with spices, with gold, with ivory and slave. Ivory slaves were the most desired because it was easy for them to achieve and easy to sell. But also they had to come back with some more maps and more information about people, about lands and countryside. So in this way, Portugal could afford it. Still, Portugal is even today is not country with great resources. A lot of population today is like 10 million, just like Belgium or Czechia, for example, Czech Republic. So in this way, for them it was impossible to build like a huge fleet and go and straight sail like as long as it gets. So gradually it was like gradual mapping the coast, and it started already in the times when Chinese ended up their voyages to Arabia. So that was since like 1450s, 1460s, and so on. So that was the beginning, and that's why I added this map. And as you can see from Portugal, these Portuguese explorations when they started. So you got Tangier, so I'm glad I was not confused, but Ceuta, yeah, Ceuta was the first one, 1415, and that was the first like assault of Henry Navigator, still as a knight, as a prince of Portugal with his brothers, but it took them more years. So as you see, Madeira at Azores was discovered in 1419 and claimed for Portugal. 1427, the rest of Azores Islands, Canaries already in 1336, but Spain later claimed it for them. And they started with like 1430s, and as you see, Sharpshaw 1416, 1435 Rio de Oro, it means like the Golden River, Cape Bojador for Cape Bojador. You see 1430s and 1440s already near Cape Verde Islands, and the Cape Verde 1440s and 60s and so on. Benin discovered much later, 1480s and so on. So again, it took them many years when they start up this organization because it was very expensive. So every time they had to firstly find some spices and slaves and so on. Of course, this is really tragic for the people who were living there, and Portugal, despite for us great explorations, but abused this. Still, it's Middle Ages, and the only excuse for us that they behave the same way for their own peasants, especially in our lands in here. But how it followed later on motivated them to look for the way later on, maybe to Asia. But at the beginning, they were not motivated so fast because Africa provided with them enough riches. When they finally seized Cape of Good Hope in 1488, so they didn't mind, like, okay, like let it here and maybe one day we sail to Asia. But what happened? That Spaniards suddenly organized voyage that discovered these lands, and they didn't know whether it is Asia or not. Nobody knew where is the ending. So they organized more and more voyages to in order to get to India, especially, and Indonesia. They really didn't have idea how far it is, how long, and in extents of territories, how big it is and how long it is. Okay, so when we come to the guys, I divided usually between Portuguese and Spanish discoverers or navigators, but I added here in chronological way, so we have these guys mixed up. So let's start with the first one. So Portuguese first concern on sailing to India around Africa, and as I said, it was all kind of like gradual mapping the coast. And when the ship was full of new goods for them, so they rather came back to Portugal and like got on the voyage again in a couple of years. So in this way, took them many years since like 1440s from the Guinea Bay down to South Africa. Especially these territories were really harsh for them because this is Namibia, and the name of these African countries, according to the desert called Namib, that there is no water at all, no food, nothing. We know that there are diamonds today and many other metals, but of course for them it was impossible. So even what happened that even to India sometimes Portuguese had to export metals that they lacked, and it was, for example, copper. And if you remember when I told you about Slovakia's medieval mining, and especially late Middle Ages, this Fugger Turzo company, that was mining company, they were exploiting copper from surroundings of Banska Bystrica and Špania Dolina, and we have beautiful discovery of by National Geographic and even our historians from Mining Museum and Kremnica Museum showed a nice documentary about the ship that shipwrecked in here. You probably remember this with the loads of balls made of copper that were being exported to India for Portuguese needs. But what happened? Bartolomeu Diaz in 1488 finally managed to come to South Africa. As you see that this is actually a very long way, and they were not sure whether there is no other land going down to the south. Finally, when they came to this Rio Great Fish, so according to winds and very strong pulse streams, Bartolomeu Diaz was pretty sure that he found a passage to the open ocean, so he could back home. But it was really difficult for them because their caravelas that were really small, as I told you, almost shipwrecked, and there were a lot of storms, and the ocean was really wild. So when he was reporting this to the king of Portugal, I believe it was Joao the second, so John the second, and I'm not sure, so sorry for mistakes. I will make these corrections in the commentaries in this below the YouTube video. So when he reported it, he called it like, so how did you call this cape then to miss? And he said, we call it a storm cape. Burkovimis. Oh, come on! Like nobody would like to go there. Even today, we got problems to hire enough sailors willing to sail for these like long journeys. So let's call it Cape of Good Hope. That we have good hope that we will sail to India. So in this way, as you can see, so Portuguese gradually sometimes built small forts in here, but it was real difficult because they were being under attacks of local African tribes, logically because they had to defend against these new slave masters. So very often they especially on the other coast of Africa, on the east coast, they tried to cooperate with Arabs, but soon they realized, Arabs, I mean, realized that Portuguese actually in concurrence, and they start attacking Portuguese ships. So since next time, again, you cannot see it, but this is replica of Bartolomeu Diaz ship. So it looks really like a boat, not a ship, and courageous sailors, so great heroes of Portugal. But the thing is, the point is that Portugal at the time still used the system of Henry the Navigator style. That if you had idea where to sail, how to sail, you need to build like write a project you have like proposal for practice, and if and you had to present it to the king, But just like you expect your project work this year, third graders, you'll have to present it and defend it against our question, hesitation. Will it really work for you? Or I don't know, some of my guys, Shimon, like, will it really work for this? Or is it the usage realistic or not? And the committee of experts, of navigators and retired explorers and geographers, astronomers, was actually judging, evaluating your project. So it happened very often that this Portuguese council, royal council, refused many unrealistic projects, and among them there were two, and that was proposal of Genoese navigator that he asked Portugal for a fleet of ships. Christopher Colombo to sail across the Atlantic Ocean to the west because he believed that there is land, and he asked him like, what land? Well, it is Kitai, and actually they these Portuguese counselors, how to call them. So they actually mocked him, made fun of Columbus that he can't count, he didn't know mathematics, because according to the kind of like shape of the Earth, their voyage wouldn't last 1 month as he claimed, but it would last like 2 or 3 years, which is impossible considering technically they were not able to build ships. What if there are no islands, no water? So it was impossible for them to build ships like this. And this mistake was really Columbus. He was actually lying because it was 3 months, not 1 month, and it was not China, it was America. He was just lucky that it was continent just between, Europe and Asia, across Atlantic and Pacific later on. The same point was actually with their own Portugal navigator Fernando Magalhães, or Ferdinand Magellan, and he proposed another voyage that already America was already discovered in the north part, and he wanted to sail along the southern coast down to the south, find the passage, and across the other ocean they expected to be come to China. They again said that it's unrealistic. So both of these, Christoph Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan, find another country to offer it, and that was Spain. Again, I need to check. I need to check the time I have, and we are done. So we had just introduction to this age of discoveries. Next lesson we'll move on to particular the other navigators and particular things. I can tell you that probably it will last me another maybe even 2 lessons. So just keep on working on your assignment, guys, and don't forget to answer the question and greeting, and that's all from me, teacher. So stay negative in tests and positive in mind, guys. Bye bye. See you next time.